artists, and welcome back to Art at Home with Miss Q. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can make your very own 3D paper flowers using just paper plates. Now, if you don't have paper plates at home, that's okay. I'm also going to show you a technique that you can do with just paper. And if you don't happen to have paper, well gosh, you could even do the same thing with newspaper. Anything you find recycled will work just fine. I got a pack of these at the dollar store for $1, you guessed it. And the cheaper they are, the better, because you want to be able to cut through them easily. Now I'm going to be making my 3D flowers into a jar of flowers to hold them. I'm going to be using this as a card for Mother's Day, but you don't have to be doing this for Mother's Day. You could do this for yourself, for somebody else special in your life, whatever it is. You don't have to do this part with the jar, but I decided to make mine into a card. Before we get started, we always say our mantra to make us ready to create and learn. My mantra: I am positive, I am creative, I am mindful, I am amazing, I am an artist. All right, let's get started. You're going to need some paper plates, some scissors, some tape, a pencil. I'm using tacky glue, but if you have permission or access to hot glue is actually going to work best and dry the quickest. Let's go.
Once I've gathered all my supplies, I'm going to start with one paper plate and a pair of scissors. When I use my scissors, I'm going to start out by making a cut into the plate and then turn my scissors and go around the shape of a circle in that middle, making sure to carefully cut out using little baby shark chomps, moving slowly even though I fast forwarded my video. Then I'm going to put aside the circle for later and take my scissors and make a fringe along the outside rim of that plate. Now when I'm making that fringe, I'm making one big chomp, but making sure I don't go through to the other side. I have to leave a little bit at the bottom. That way I can use it to curl up around itself and start wrapping it around and round, holding it with one hand as I turn with the other and hold it at the base. Once I wrap it around and hold it at the base, it's going to start forming the shape of a flower. Now I'm going to need a piece of tape to hold that together, otherwise it's going to all come apart. So I'm making sure that that base is all together and putting one piece of tape around that side there. It's okay if it gets a little bit loose. You might actually prefer it to be a little bit looser, that way it can be bigger. If you want it to be smaller, you might have it a little bit tighter curled up there. Now I'm going to take that circle I set aside earlier and I'm going to use it as a base for my flower. Now you could do different shapes here, but I decided to do a fringe again, making some large cuts around the edges and turning as I go, but making sure not to cut all the way into the center. That way I now have a base where I can glue that other part of my flower that I used on the edge of the paper plate. I can glue that into the middle. It's almost like a flower bud that's starting to bloom, and now I'm gathering around the outside shape for those outside petals. Once I put some glue in the middle and stick that middle piece in, now I can start to shape my sculpture. I'm going to need to pull out some of those petals and start to sculpt with my hands. I might need to curve the outside up, I might need to put more glue in the middle, I might need to start to pull back some of those flower petals to really make it start looking like a flower. It's going to take some time, and sometimes the glue likes to slip. So this is why hot glue really works best, but it also could be dangerous, and sometimes you don't even have it. So I'm showing you using regular glue. Of course, something like white glue, like a tacky glue, is going to be best, but Elmer's could work too. Just make sure that you allow plenty of dry time and use a lot of it. I know I usually don't say that. Now I did the same technique where I cut out the outside rim of that circle, but now I'm cutting a different pattern. Notice I'm doing the same thing where I stop at the edge, not cutting all the way through, but this time I'm doing a zigzag. That's going to make it look like a different kind of flower, maybe more like a rose. You can practice cutting all different shapes of petals and then curling it around itself, wrapping it up, putting a little piece of tape on the end to hold it together, and then you can play with it and sculpt it and pull out some of those petals to start to form your flower. Now I'm going to cut a different kind of base. This time I'm going to use my pencil to sketch out a flower. You can make yours rounded, you can make it pointed at the ends, you could make it any kind of flower you wanted to. I'm just going to do a basic 5-petal flower here with some curved edges and see what it looks like. Now sometimes you need to make a cut a little bit deeper into that flower for those petals to be able to curl up to really hold that base in the middle. You'll notice it looks a little bit too big for my flower bud in the center, so I decided to make the outside base smaller by going back with my scissors and cutting more off. It's okay, this takes a lot of practice and there's no wrong way to do it. Any flower you make is awesome, and there's so many different types of flowers that there is no way that you can mess this up. So I'm going to go ahead and do more glue in the center, hold that down for at least 10 seconds, even though it doesn't look like it with my fast forwarded video, and then start to sculpt that flower the same way. And it looks awesome. I'm going to put it aside to dry, and then you guessed it, I'm doing the same exact technique that I started the other two flowers. Now this time I'm going to make a double base. This flower is going to have 3 layers instead of just 2. So I held that one on top of that circle so I could see how big to make my next flower. I'm making it very similar to the last one, except this time I'm going to make sure that I put those petals on the other side. I rotate it so they don't exactly match up and I can see them in between every other petal. It looks awesome, and I just put some glue and let it dry. Now I'm going to use this because I don't want to let it go to waste, and I'm going to make those curvy petals instead. Up and down and up and down, up and down. If you want to sketch it out first, you absolutely could, because I know this is a lot of cutting and your hands can get tired. And sometimes it's hard to remember exactly where to cut, and you don't want to cut all the way through that paper plate or the curling up part won't work. To add a piece of tape on the side to hold it together, and this one I'm going to put aside and maybe leave by itself. Maybe this flower doesn't need to have a base to glue it on. Maybe this one could just be a small flower by itself. You could absolutely just use the outside border of the plate for a flower, like I'm doing with the scraps here. I'm using the scrap from my last one. Instead of wasting it, I'm curling that one up and making a rose out of it. It looks awesome just by itself. I don't even need to make a flower base like I did for the other two to make them bigger. If you don't have paper plates, this is how you can still make a flower with just a piece of paper. Fold it in half hot dog style, or kind of like a taco, and then I'm going to use my scissors on the closed side of the paper, not the open side, and I'm going to do the same fringe technique where I stop cutting when I get towards the end of the paper. I don't want to cut all the way through. Now that my paper is all fringed, I'm going to roll that bottom open side, roll it up, roll it up, roll it up, just the way I did with the paper plate, and then put a piece of tape on the end. Now this is going to give me a fringe flower, and it looks awesome. This is another way that you can make flowers out of just paper if you don't have paper plates. You can even start to add on to that flower by doing that same technique again, and this time I'm going to wrap this flower around the outside to make an even better, awesome, bigger flower. So you could do this several different ways and experiment yourself with how you want to make it and how big you want to make it. It's totally up to you. Whenever you're done and put the piece of tape on the end, make sure you spend some time fluffing your flower. You might even need to get a pencil and start to stick it into those parts that are open to start to open them up more and make them more rounded and petal-like rather than just flat pieces of paper. You have to take some time to make it a sculpture, which is something you can see all the way around. It's not just flat paper. So now I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to do it with newspaper. So even if you don't have regular paper, you could do this out of recycled newspaper or magazines. That same style of folding the paper in half, cutting the side that has the closed, rolling it up on the open side, and then starting to pull those petals out. Now that I'm starting to get a lot of flowers made, I'm going to place my favorite ones on a paper plate and put it aside. This is going to be the ones that I decide to use in my final sculpture. Not every one might be my best or my favorite. It takes a lot of practice. I'm going to do the same technique where I go around the edges and make that fringe, stopping my scissors before I get to the end of my paper plate and cut through. After I have my fringe, I'm going to roll it up, same process as you've seen. By now you probably get the idea and could make some of your own. I think I'm going to make one last flower before I go ahead and start to arrange them in my final composition, or the way I'm going to lay out my art. I'm going to make one more drawing on that base, a flower, maybe a smaller one this time, and I'm going to lay one of my scrap pieces from that. I'm going to roll that one up. It looks a little bit like a rose when I roll up my scraps and tape them together. I'm going to press down on that bottom so it gets nice and flat, glue it to the center of this base, press down, start to shape it and make it into that sculpture. and then I'm going to put them aside. Now I'm going to use a separate paper plate to make my jar for my flowers to go in. This is totally optional, but if you want to follow along, I'm using my paper plate and the curved part at the bottom to make the curved part of my jar look like it's 3D. So I'm drawing an oval shape on the bottom, and then from my oval, I'm going to draw 2 vertical lines going up on both sides. Then I'm going to complete my jar by making another oval at the top. So I have an oval at the top, an oval at the bottom, and 2 straight vertical lines on the sides. That's going to give me a 3D jar shape, or a cylinder. That is the name for the form that I just drew. Then I cut it out very carefully, and now I can take my pencil and start to draw some detail. I'm going to add some lines and some shadows to make it look more 3D. But now I'm going to go ahead and see if it's going to fit my flowers in that jar. I think it'll fit pretty good, but I don't want that whole big paper plate. So I'm going to take the top paper plate where my flowers were, fold it in half, cut it in half, and then glue my jar right there on the middle at the bottom. Now I can add lots of glue to the top to start to glue my flowers. But first, make sure you arrange them how you want. The goal is to cover up that top paper plate so you can't see it. Now the reason that we need that top paper plate is as a base. If I were to just glue the flowers to the jar, well, they wouldn't have anything to stick to. It also wouldn't hold it up very well if I glued these to a regular piece of construction paper. That would just flop and fall right over because the paper plates are heavier than regular paper. So if you're using regular paper for this, make sure that you're using a heavyweight paper, maybe like a poster board. But that's why the paper plates work so well. After I glue them all into place and I have my form of my flowers in my jar, I'm going to really take a look and draw from observation at a mason jar. I noticed that this mason jar, it is clear. It's made out of glass, so it's going to be tricky to get the exact color because it doesn't really have color. So I'm going to have to use the graphite of my pencil to try to get those highlights and shadows as best as I can. Maybe include some of the details like this circle in the middle. I use that jar to trace a circle, but you could use any kind of lid or circle shape you have. Then I'm going to write inside of the jar, I'm going to write Happy Mother's Day. Usually in a jar, it's going to have the brand of the jar on it written on there, but I'm going to write Happy Mother's Day because I'm using this as a card. If you're not creating this as a card and you would rather just have it colored, I always suggest doing your painting or coloring with markers or crayons before you start the process of sculpting with the paper plates and cutting and gluing. It's a good idea to do all your painting or coloring on the plain paper plates first. Start doing the cutting, gluing, and sculpting of your flowers when it's all dry. But I'm going to use some pencil details to make it look realistic and add that detail for the Mother's Day card. Maybe use the other half of the paper plate as a table. You could color it as a tablecloth. That could give it an extra support for the base, or you could create your own base with another paper plate by folding the bottom just a little bit to give it a flat edge, and then curving the sides in and folding them as well. You're going to want to try to fold it to the same width as the jar so you don't show any extra, and then fold in those bottom pieces and tape them together. I'm going to tape them together, that way I can do this quick and don't have to wait for the glue to dry. I'm going to put tape securely on both sides, and then I'm going to put glue on the back and glue the back of my flower vase and jar to the back of this base. After I let the glue dry, I might secure it with a little bit extra tape and then see if it stands up. If it doesn't stand up, oh well, it's still 3D and you could probably lean it up against a table. Mine stood for just a little bit, but it still needs to dry, so I'm going to lay it back down and see what happens. I want to see what you create though, so make sure you take a picture of your artwork and upload it to Artsonia if you're my student. All right, artists, have fun.